afternoon. We have a little break in the program now because there's some developing news happening in Rome this morning. Mr. Ferrara and myself went down to the Vatican press office this morning to gain some press credentials in order to get advanced copies of a new instruction which the Commission Ecclesia Dei has just released through the press concerning the motu proprio summorum pontificum. And we were, as everyone else, kind of wondering what this was going to entail. Was it going to be good news or bad news? And now after some reflection and some time to read it, we've discovered that the document is actually very good news. And so we wanted to just spend a few moments here sharing with you, in case you hadn't heard, what took place this morning in Rome. A couple of points of significance. It's interesting because there actually is a parallel between what's happening with the motu proprio over the past 3 years and what's been happening for 100 years with respect to the Fatima message. Sort of a cover-up. There's been a rejection, especially among liberal, progressive, modernist bishops. There's been essentially a rejection of the Holy Father's wishes with respect to the return of the traditional Latin liturgy. And so I think that's not at all incongruent to discuss this for a few moments anyway at a Fatima conference. We were very pleased to see that the Holy Father made a specific point of approving this document and signing this instruction on the feast of St. Pius V. And what seems to be generally obvious as you read the document is that this is an issue that simply is not going away with respect to Pope Benedict XVI. The issue of liturgical restoration is clearly on the front burner. He is making a concerted, a very important effort to make sure the bishops of the world, not only the bishops but the faithful of the world, understand their right to have access to the traditional Mass, and not just the traditional Latin Mass, but the traditional sacraments as well, including confirmation and the other sacraments. He's empowered the priests of the world to take advantage of the motu proprium to the fullest extent. And so we want to share with you now what I think is really a positive development with respect to the Holy Father and the traditional Latin Mass. Chris?
I feel like the legal analyst for Fox TV. I'm the legal analyst for Fatima TV. Well, we were all afraid that they would be chipping away at the motu proprio and that this instruction would come out with all kinds of limitations that would reverse the trend, the clear trend toward a restoration of the traditional Mass, which, by the way, as we have been learning from press accounts, is primarily a phenomenon among young people, not the province of a few diehard nostalgists, as the neo-modernist brigades had assured everyone. This is the future of the Church. The newest thing in the Church is the ancient liturgy, and that's what's happening today. So we were all worried that there'd be restrictions and attempts to retrace our steps back to the status quo, the so-called epoch of the indult, when we have grudging permission here and there. But that did not happen here. There are a couple of points of concern, but overall, this is a bad day for the enemies of the traditional liturgy and a good day for its friends. Let me just give you a quick tour of the document. It begins by saying that the motu proprio summorum pontificum is universal law for the Church, intended to establish new regulations for the use of the Roman liturgy in effect in 1962. So we're dealing with a universal law of the Church, meaning an act of the magisterium, and most theologians would agree, an act of the infallible magisterium to the extent that it binds the universal Church. The universal disciplinary measures are considered to be within the charism of infallibility, and I would think that the restoration of the traditional liturgy would fit that description. Now, it says that it reaffirms the traditional principle recognized from time immemorial and necessary to be maintained into the future, I'm quoting verbatim, that, quoting Summorum Pontificum, each particular church must be in accord with the universal church, not only regarding the doctrine of the faith and sacramental signs, but also as to the usages universally handed down by apostolic and unbroken tradition. These are to be maintained not only so that errors may be avoided, but also so that the faith may be passed on in its integrity, since the church's rule of prayer, lex orandi, corresponds to her rule of belief, lex credendi. So this is a ringing affirmation of the principle that the usages of the traditional Roman liturgy are handed down not only by custom, but by apostolic tradition. So much for the neo-Catholic bromide that the liturgy is something which is merely a matter of custom that the Pope may dispose of as he sees fit. When he was writing his Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope rejected that very idea, cautioning that the Pope is a custodian of what is handed down, not its owner. It also goes on to say, to cite as two examples of the proper approach to preserving the liturgy, get this, St. Gregory the Great and St. Pius V, on whose feast day this document was released. So that's a nod of approval and, in fact, a celebration of two of the greatest popes in church history, who are great precisely because of their stewardship of the traditional Roman rite, which, as this document says, they kept up to date throughout the centuries until the time of Blessed Pope John the 23rd. And then the document notes subsequently in 1970, following the liturgical reform after the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI approved to the Church of the Latin Rite a new missal. It's rather faint praise, but it does say that the traditional missal was famously preserved in its integrity for centuries by these two great popes and all the other popes. It goes on to say that the mind of the Pope is to be followed, and this is where I think the document is at its strongest. It cautions the bishops that the motu proprio is to be monitored, the application of it is to be monitored, in other words, watched but not controlled by the bishops, always in keeping with the mind of the Pope, as expressed in the motu proprio. And what does the Pope express as the mind of the Pope? According to this document, we must keep in mind, as he says in the motu proprio, what was sacred for prior generations remains sacred and great for us as well, and cannot be suddenly prohibited altogether or even judged harmful. And then it goes on to clarify what the Pope intended to do with the motu proprio. And here's what he intended to do. It had the aim of, and I quote, offering to all the faithful the Roman liturgy in the usus antiquor, the ancient usage, considered as a precious treasure to be preserved, and also effectively guaranteeing and ensuring the use of the forma extraordinaria, traditional Latin Mass, for all who ask for it, given that the use of the 1962 Roman liturgy is a faculty generously granted for the good of the faithful and therefore is to be interpreted in a sense favorable to the faithful who are its principal addressees. So the Pope is making it quite clear here that this is not for a few nostalgic diehards. All the faithful, not just those who were attached to the Roman Rite before the Second Vatican Council, but all those who are becoming attached to it, have a right to it. And that is the mind of the Pope. Then the Pope sets up a legal structure. Under this legal structure, the Ecclesia Dei Commission will sit as an appellate tribunal, and the faithful will be entitled to make appeals to this appellate tribunal, the Commission Ecclesia Dei, against, and I'm quoting, any possible singular administrative provision of an ordinary which appears to be contrary to the motu proprio. So if the bishop makes a decision that appears to be contrary to the mind of the Pope in the motu proprio, we can appeal that decision to the Ecclesia Dei Commission, which is now explicitly given the power to issue decisions that bind the bishops. And the bishops have recourse only to the Apostolic Signatura, the highest tribunal in the Church, which in my view is not likely to reverse the Papal Commission. And then Ecclesia Dei will have the task of looking after future editions of liturgical texts. And that's an area of concern. If there are future editions, we have to worry about what those editions will contain, but we'll worry about that when the time comes. It goes on to address this problem of the group of the faithful who request the traditional Latin Mass. Some bishops were attempting to set numerical limitations on the minimum, and this document says a group of the faithful is any number of the faithful, some people, whoever they are. It also says, to do another end run around the bishops who were saying the group of the faithful must be within a particular parish, that the group of the faithful can be persons, and I'm quoting, coming from different parishes or dioceses who gather together in a specific parish church or in an oratory or chapel for this purpose. So if 50 people come from 50 different places and they converge on this chapel for the purpose of celebrating the traditional Latin liturgy, that is a group of the faithful. It could be 50 people, 5 people, 10 people. There is no specific number. Furthermore, it says, in cases in which groups are quite small, quote, they may approach the ordinary of the place to identify a church in which these faithful may be able to come together for such celebrations. So if 5 people only or 10 people only would like to have a traditional Latin Mass, they can go to the bishop and say, well, how about that church over there? Can we have our Mass there? And if the bishop says no, we can appeal it to the Ecclesia Dei Commission. That would be an event as to which we could have recourse. Now, listen to this. Even in sanctuaries, this is exactly a quote from the document. Even in sanctuaries and places of pilgrimage, the possibility to celebrate in the forma extraordinaria is to be offered to groups of pilgrims who request it if there is a qualified priest, which brings us to the next issue. Some bishops were trying to use the phrase qualified priest. The Latin term is idoneus, I believe. Idoneus. They were trying to use that as a barricade to liturgical restoration by saying, well, of course we need to have a Latin test. It has to be a 20-month course, and then we'll have a rigorous examination at the end. And if the priest can translate Latin into English from any given text, then we'll allow him to offer the traditional Mass. Says this document. This document says that a qualified priest is simply every Catholic priest who is not impeded by canon law is to be considered idoneus, qualified for the celebration of the Holy Mass in the forma extraordinaria. Of course, he has to have some knowledge of what he's celebrating, and the knowledge required is, quote, the ability to pronounce the words correctly and understand their meaning. Furthermore, the bishops are not allowed to administer a Latin test because, according to the document, quote, regarding knowledge of the execution of the rite, priests are presumed to be qualified who present themselves spontaneously to celebrate the forma extraordinaria and have celebrated it previously. So if a priest says, well, I've already celebrated the Latin Mass, Your Excellency, I know all about it, the bishop cannot say, yes, but you must submit to a Latin Mass examination. We have to be sure you're qualified, and we'll let you know in 6 or 8 months. That's done with. A priest who has celebrated the Latin Mass before and spontaneously presents himself to the bishop is presumed to be qualified, and in fact, every Catholic priest is presumed to be qualified for that reason, if not impeded by canon law. Also, it goes on to say that, as the motu proprio did, every priest in the church, without exception, every priest, whether or not he's a member of a traditional society of apostolic life or an institute, has the faculty to celebrate his Mass privately in the traditional form, quote, without any special permission from their ordinaries or superiors. So the entire church, without exception, every priest in the Roman Rite has the ability to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass privately, and if a few members of the faithful show up, that's not prohibited. Liturgical books. We have the right to use not only the traditional missal, but the traditional breviary, traditional pontifical, and the traditional rituale for societies of apostolic life that are under the Ecclesia Dei Commission already. And there is an area of some concern here. New saints and certain of the new prefaces can and ought to be inserted into the 1962 Missal. But the 62 Missal was always open to the insertion of new saints and prefaces. Notice that there's no indication here that the Novus Ordo calendar as such, or readings, can be inserted into the 1962 Missal. And to make that clear, in terms of the rubrics, the door has been slammed on any attempt to impose altar girls, communion in the hand, or any of the other Novus Ordo rubrics on the traditional rite. The document says, and I quote, Furthermore, by virtue of its character of special law within its own area, the motu proprio summorum pontificum derogates from those provisions of law connected with the sacred rites promulgated from 1962 onwards and incompatible with the rubrics of the liturgical books in effect in 1962. No rubric incompatible with the traditional Mass can be imposed upon it by a bishop. There can be no communion in the hand, altar girls, female lectors, even male lectors for that matter, whatsoever, because this Mass, the traditional Mass, derogates from the Novus Ordo. So there's a reversal of the process by which the Novus Ordo derogated from the traditional Mass. Now the traditional Mass derogates from the Novus Ordo and partially repeals it to that extent in terms of both celebration of the rite itself and the rubrics associated with it. And then the document also says confirmation and holy orders are to be permitted in the traditional form, and also in institutes of consecrated life and societies of apostolic life, which are under the Pontifical Commission, Ecclesia Dei. As I mentioned earlier, they can use the Pontificale Romanum. And another area of concern was the motu proprio seemed to make an exception for the Easter Triduum. That has been clarified. The sacred Triduum in the forma extraordinaria is to be made available to the faithful if there is a qualified priest, which we've already discussed, any priest who understands what the Latin is and the meaning of the words he's pronouncing. And the sacred Triduum in the traditional form is to be available even if there must be a repetition of the Triduum in the Novus Ordo form in the same church. So you will have basically, if there's a Novus Ordo Mass there and the faithful want the traditional Triduum in that parish, it has to be provided, not excluding the possibility that you'll have two Triduums, the traditional one and the Novus Ordo one, in a parish that's already a Novus Ordo parish. And of course, in traditional parishes, we'll have only the traditional Triduum. So that's been cleared up. There's one provision that concerns me and should concern everyone, paragraph 19. The faithful who ask for the celebration of the forma extraordinaria must not in any way support or belong to groups which show themselves to be against the validity or legitimacy of the Holy Mass or the sacraments celebrated in the forma ordinaria, meaning the Novus Ordo, or against the Roman Pontiff as supreme pastor of the universal church. I'm reading this as a lawyer, and I'm thinking of this kind of thing in a First Amendment context. Must not belong to or support groups which show themselves. What does that mean? What does support mean? To be against the validity or legitimacy. Well, I don't know any traditionalist that I would associate with who says the new Mass is per se invalid, but certainly many people have questioned the legitimacy of the reform, including the Pope himself when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, when he signed on to the analysis by in the reform of the Roman liturgy by, what's his name? Escapes me. Klaus Gamber. In the French edition, he wrote the preface to that, and Klaus Gamber called it a banal, on-the-spot product. He called it a break with liturgical tradition, and Cardinal Ratzinger fully approved of that, and he called, in fact, the imposition of the new missal a rupture in liturgical history whose consequences could only be tragic. Now, if we're forbidden to criticize the new liturgy in any way, shape, or form under paragraph 19, I doubt it, that would be a problem. So it remains to be seen whether this provision would be employed as a kind of ideological litmus test by bishops. I'm hoping that it won't be, and I'm hoping that we would not be denied the same freedom we've always had in virtue of this paragraph 19. That, to me, is the biggest problem with the document. But if you construe it narrowly, I would read it to say people who deny that the Pope is the Pope, i.e. Sede Vacantis, who claim that the new Mass is per se invalid, those people would have a problem getting permission for the new Mass, but I don't see how that would apply to anyone else I would call a traditionalist. So overall, I think this is bad news for the bishops who have tried to undermine the motu proprio, and overall good news for the movement for a liturgical restoration.
We have to. Yep. We can't take any questions right now. We have to step aside for a Q&A session that's just beginning. But just keep an eye on this breaking story and the whole idea of the connection between Fatima and the restoration of the traditional liturgy in order to restore Catholic identity as Pope Benedict wants to do. It's a big story. Keep an eye on it and pray for the best. Thank you very much.
For those of you who have been to the other sessions, you'll recognize me as the devil's advocate. I'm Ed Faust, appropriately named for the job. Someone asked me at lunch why we don't have opponents or critics of the Fatima Center's position represented more broadly here, or at least, with some measure of proportion at the conferences. And I explained before that the reason I'm the devil's advocate is because Father Gruner invites everyone to these conferences, his supporters, his friends, his critics, his opponents, and offers them the facilities of the conference. But unfortunately, people who are opposed to the interpretation of Fatima put forth by Father are also reluctant to engage him in honest debate in an open forum. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing here today. So we'll start. The first question is for Father Gruner, and it's sort of a carryover from something we started on Tuesday that Father didn't get to address, I think, as fully as he might like to. In June 2000, the Vatican accompanied the publication of the Vision of the Third Secret with a document titled The Message of Fatima. The document purported to be an aid in interpreting the vision, and it describes the Fatima apparitions and message as private revelation, which imposes no obligation upon a Catholic, as does public revelation, which must be believed. Can you speak, Father, about the distinction and how Fatima is to be classified in light of this traditional dichotomy?
Well, I think, first of all, as I did mention, I believe, in one of my talks, but there are not just two kinds of revelation, but three, according to both Bishop Graber, for example, the theologian bishop in Germany, who wrote the book on St. Athanasius for our times. He's well recognized in his day. He wrote on Fatima also. And there he points out that there's not two kinds of revelation. That is just simply public revelation, or the deposit of the faith being closed with the death of the last apostle. That certainly is true, but there is a public prophetic revelation, which does not, as St. Thomas points out, give a new doctrine, but reminds the faithful what they must do at this time to save their souls. And so this is something that is binding, but does not contradict or add to the deposit of faith. And on that basis, there is, when the people, this is the first thing, to frame the argument. If you just say you have two choices, you can either drink this water or this water, you have no other choices. This you don't have to take, but you have to take this. If you accept their terms of the argument, you've already lost the argument in the first place. So it's important that we define the terms of the argument well. And so the Fatima is not just a private revelation, as some people try to make it out to be. How else can you characterize something that is given to the Church, which tells us that if we don't listen to it, that entire nations will be annihilated, that the Pope will have much to suffer, the faithful will be martyred, the good will be martyred, the Holy Father much to suffer, various nations annihilated. Now there are those who might contend, despite this message coming from heaven, with all the signs that God, more signs that God has given to this message than he's given to some of his miracles in Scripture. And he expects us to believe those messages, and which I certainly do. But therefore, as the First Vatican Council tells us, that the signs that the greatest proofs of God's message is true is, one, true miracles, and two, true prophecy that comes true. You have both of those things in the Fatima, and therefore we should not be judged less bound because they're not, quote unquote, in the deposit of faith, according to this definition of things. I hope that that helps. I understand that there are people who don't think to the substance of things, but think in terms of party lines. There are liberals and there are conservatives. There are super liberals and there are super traditionalists who will not accept this distinction. But I don't ask them to think in terms of what party you belong to, but what is the truth of the matter in itself. And that is the question that really is essential here, because if we can reject Fatima out of hand by saying it's a private revelation, and the next thing that follows from that is we don't have to pay attention to it, and we don't have to obey it, and there's no moral consequences to ourselves for not doing so, I believe that it is a morally indefensible position. I realize that it might be, some theologians may not agree with us. I think you could spend several days debating this if they really want to go to the wall on it, but it's important that you realize that it is controverted, and I've yet to find any theologian who's been able to prove me wrong on this. And I'm quite prepared, with a little bit of preparation, to take anyone on it, from whatever quarter, left, right, center, or wherever. It is essential to understanding the obligation of the Pope and the bishops and the priests and the faithful to making Fatima essential to their program of life now. And for the Church collectively to do that, including the obligation to consecrate Russia. People can put it down to my either zeal or enthusiasm. I would just like them to say, find an intelligent answer to what we've said on this thing. And don't please tell me it's a private revelation. But if you want to, I will show you that that's not all it is. I hope that helps.
I'd like to add only one thing to that. What we profess in the Apostles' Creed, in the Nicene Creed, etc., when we make the act of faith, we are making the assent of faith, the assent of divine and Catholic faith to what has been revealed by God and set forth to us by the magisterium of the Church. So there is the obligation of faith to believe that. There is, however, the moral obligation that we must believe when God speaks. St. Alphonsus Liguori explains that if a person receives a prophetic revelation from God, he's bound to believe it. And this is definitely the sense of Pope John Paul II when he said, he spoke of the obligation to believe in Fatima when he said that the message of Fatima imposes a commitment on the Church.
My next question is for Cornelia Ferrara. You present the United Nations and Fatima as necessarily being in opposition to one another. Yet the popes of the past half-century are of another mind, as your talk amply demonstrated. Is it not possible that the United Nations can be a force for good, a place where nations can at least try to avoid armed conflict through discussion, even though this at times proves ineffectual? Why should it not be encouraged along with Fatima?
Well, I think I showed in my talk that the whole setup of the United Nations, who founded it, what philosophy they follow, is completely against the teachings of the Catholic Church. And there's no way we could get to have an agreement, I think, on moral issues, because a lot of the things concern morals to some degree. You know, I'm reminded of Jesus in the desert when he was fasting, and then the devil came along and had a, basically, I could call it, a dialogue with him. And in the end, Jesus just said, forget it, I'm not talking to you. And because I don't think we can dialogue with the devil. And I think I've shown, with all the stuff I said in my talk, that this United Nations started out badly, for a bad reason, to destroy the Catholic Church through various forces that it has in its employ, and therefore we cannot dialogue with it. We are not going to get anywhere. You cannot dialogue with the devil. That's impossible. We won't win.
I'd like to add one thing again, just the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he described the United Nations as an immoral organization in an immoral world.
The next question is at first for Father Gruner. Anyone else can contribute. The Pope has said recently that he is too much of a rationalist to believe in the sort of miraculous conversion some think would follow the consecration of Russia. He's also said that there will be no acts of entrustment to Mary at this time. This does not sound like a pope who wants to perform the consecration, as some at this conference have alleged. Can you explain this apparent discrepancy?
Well, I've been told yesterday that the Pope has been announced, and I'm afraid I don't have the actual source, but actually Maurizio D'Orlando, who was here with us on Monday, sent a message to Monica, I believe it was, that the Pope plans to consecrate Italy to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and he plans to do it this month. Sometimes the magisterium gets confused with private books put out by the Pope. I believe we're quoting from a book about someone interviewing him on some subject I've just forgotten. And it may well be that he thinks that way about the consecration of Russia. I have yet to have the chance to discuss the matter with him, although we've offered to, we've sought an audience. But anyway, of course, the point being that whether he does the consecration or not, I think, is whether he survives the predicted sentence for not doing it, which our Lord has pronounced, saying that the King of France suffered death and execution as a criminal for not doing what our Lord told him to do after 100 years. And I believe the same thing will apply to the Pope for not listening, not because I wish it upon him, but because that's the truth of the matter. It is that serious. So obviously, if he thinks this way, we need to pray for him more. And I encourage bishops, priests, and anyone else they can get to pray for the Holy Father to do the consecration before it's too late for him and for so many of us suffering because this is not done in time. I don't know if does that answer the question directly?
That's fine, Father, yes. The next question is directed first at Cornelia Ferrara, though I believe Father Kramer has some expertise in this area, so I'd like his comments also. Nationalism has often been described as a kind of false religion that has led to many wars. Even if it's not done through the auspices of the United Nations, what is wrong with broadening human sympathies beyond national borders and trying to create a peaceful one-world government, even if that government would honor religious pluralism?
I think that's several questions in one. You said nationalism. Well, there's a difference between nationalism and patriotism. We're all in a country, we're born into a country or we're citizens of a country, and we have to give our loyalty to the country. That's always been accepted by the church. There should be, if everybody is a Catholic, united together, you could have, I suppose, a peaceful government. Christendom is the perfect example of that. But what we're talking about today is people from all different religions, ways of life, and so forth, and atheism, and paganism, and occultism, all trying to supposedly blend. That's an impossibility. How can you possibly do that? And I don't know if that's answering the question, or Father Kramer, something more?
A world government cannot possibly function in a just manner. If we doubt that for a moment, just look at the functioning of the European Union with all the unjust decrees that are being imposed on nations from Brussels. It cannot work. Each nation has its own temperament, its own traditions, its own culture. And as Aristotle says, a universal statute cannot be universally applicable. In the very nature of things, there are exceptions, because such universal decrees cannot possibly fit everyone. One size does not fit all. On the other hand, also there is to consider the fact that once there is a universal regime, a world government, a world police force, then that government, if it is corrupted and does evil, there is no recourse against it, because there is the power of the gun is in one set of hands only, and thus it opens the door to dreadful tyranny against which there is no remedy.
Because also the fact is that the only way this one world government could work is at the point of a gun. There are two ideals offered to the world. Most of the world doesn't know there's a second ideal. The ideal that's being offered to us is to have a one world, classless, religionless society in which you can have the appearances of religion, you can have the appearances of piety, but you cannot claim to have the truth that God has revealed according to the Masonic idea or ideal of a one world religion and one world government. And this whole idea of a one world government is an idea to have it away from, in contradiction to, and in replacement of Christendom and the one world religion that God has supported, has indicated, which is the Catholic Church, is in direct opposition to Christ the King. And as such, even though it has the ideal of fraternity, equality, and liberty, it is a complete sham. It's based on a lie. It will not be that, but it will be universal tyranny based on fear and based on the control of money and power by a very small group of people worldwide. And that is their declared aims in their own writings.
I might add a little something to that. What St. Augustine said and was repeated by Pope Leo is there's only two possible cities, the city of God or the city of Satan. The city of God are the people who follow the laws of God completely, as given to us by the Catholic Church. The city of Satan is against all of that. So what we're looking at today, quite obviously, is a blend of people who are not following God, the true God, through the true church. So who are they serving? Satan. It's impossible to have peace. He's the father of lies, as I showed. Lie, 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 lie. And of course, he's the murderer from the beginning also. Look at the wars. So it's totally impossible to work with these people.
I think Father Paul's book, The Mystery of Iniquity, can point out to you, if you read that carefully, how this is impossible. I'd also say, if you read the book, The Russian Sunrise, it shows how that this could be turned around and you could have a one world civilization, a Catholic civilization, respecting the various diversities of temperament and history of the various nations. Both books are there, and you have the contrast, and this is really the choice before mankind. The problem is, most people, because of the control of the media, don't even know there's a second choice. And most bishops, I presume, or most priests certainly don't know it either. But it's there, and it's the only one that's going to work. Only I can help you, Our Lady Fatima says. And this is what she's helping us against, among other things.
This will be our final question of the session. It will be directed first at Father Gruner. Mr. Tornielli yesterday directed what seemed to me a very gentlemanly chastisement that involves a criticism that has recurred through your career, Father, and it's to this effect, that our safety lies in trusting and supporting the Pope and believing that he's operating, at the will of the Blessed Mother and with the aid of the Holy Spirit in all of his decisions. And the question is, the criticism is it not presumptuous to prescribe to the Pope his duty?
Well, first of all, I think that most likely a number of things, assumptions here. I've tried to address this, but first of all, the Pope is not like an absolute monarch that God has sent. Whatever he says, you must do. All authority on earth, including the Pope's, and of course everyone else is lesser than him, and he is the highest authority. All the authority on earth is limited. is limited by God himself. In fact, dare I say that God limits his own authority on earth in dealing with us. And so if someone says to us, we must, as Mr. Tronelli seemed to say, and I must say I should correct it, I didn't do it yesterday since it wasn't really the topic of the conversation. But when he says all you have to do is except in cases of lack of, if the Pope were to say some heresy, except in that case, he said you should obey the Pope. Exactly what that means when he hasn't given an order, for example, we're not quite sure. But obey the Pope in all things other than in heresy. Mr. Tronelli, unfortunately, as he says, I'm only a journalist, I'm not a theologian, and that's quite obvious by that remark. It is not Catholic teaching. We have many examples of saints, and people have told me that I should follow the example of the saints. I try to do that. I'm very much devoted to the saints, and I do read them. I'm reminded of what St. John Gualberto did. St. John Gualberto is a canonized saint. You will find his feast day on the 12th of July in the traditional calendar. St. John Gualberto was convinced that the Archbishop of Florence should be deposed because he had paid gold to get the job. And so, following proper procedure, St. John Gualberto came down to the then Vatican, which was the Lateran office, was where the Pope was residing, and told the appropriate officials that the Archbishop of Florence should be deposed. Well, they didn't believe him. So St. John Gualberto didn't just stop there. He didn't say, well, I've washed my hands, I've put it in the hands of the Holy Father or his capable officials, and therefore I'm going to do nothing more. No, he went back to where he came from, to Vallombrosa, where he had founded his monastery. He prayed, of course, some more, and God told him basically to prove that this man had paid gold for the office. And so he called all the village people, all the people around he could get, and called them all together and announced his intention. He said, Brother Peter here is going to walk through this bonfire I'm about to light, and if he doesn't come out the other end, you know I'm wrong. But if he walks through that fire and comes out unharmed, you know that what I'm witnessing to you today is that the Archbishop should not be in office. And so he lit the fire and was fully roaring, and the way the wood was struck, he could walk through so the wood did not obstruct him that was burning, but of course he would be fried before he got through the other end if it wasn't a miracle. Brother Peter walked through and came out and was willing to walk back through again to prove the point in case there was anyone who doubted. They all insisted it wasn't necessary, and that very day they drove the Archbishop out of office themselves. He's a canonized saint. He didn't just accept what the officials in the Vatican said is what he should do. It's in the administration of the Church that he was correcting the Pope through his officials. He's not the only canonized saint to do that. And there's other men who are not canonized who have also done it. So to simply say that any time the Pope opens his mouth, or as I've had to deal with officials, cardinals of the Holy Roman Church in the last 20 years, who've assumed to themselves, since I am in charge of the dicastery of such and such, and if you want me to name them, I can, therefore when I speak, it is as if the Pope speaks, do what I say. Well, I pointed out in my complaint against this cardinal, by the way, in doing this, I followed the procedure. There's a procedure in canon law which says if you have a complaint against a cardinal, here's how you go about doing it. You file the complaint with the Pope. You explain why it is, and you give him 30 days to acknowledge receipt of that letter. If he doesn't, you go ahead and you file it again with the Pope, and you have to wait another 30 days for him to acknowledge the letter and say he's going to take the case or not. And if he doesn't, you file it a third time, in which case, by the law that John Paul II himself promulgated, he was bound to take my case because he didn't answer the third time. Needless to say, the rule of law is not being run in the Vatican these days, and was not followed. But I followed the rule of law, and I did what I had to do as far as I could with the power that God gave me and with what the law of the Church says I should do. And I believe other people should be doing the same. I hear people complaining all the time about this is bad and that's bad, and they do nothing. And they do nothing, and then they say, but it's too bad God hasn't provided for us. Well, do your resisting. To resist error in the church, even against a bad bureaucracy, even against the Vatican, is a duty of a Catholic. It's not Father Gruner's opinion. It is what the church's doctors have taught. You'll find this taught by St. Thomas Aquinas. You'll find it taught especially by St. Robert Bellarmine, who is, by the way, a doctor of the church because he defends the papacy. And as a defender of the papacy, he insists upon the necessity to resist even a pope when what he commands is bad for the church. He says, in the example I believe he gives, if it's not Suarez or Torquemada, all of them agree, that if a pope were to attack a person, to cause that person to sin with them physically, you have the right to strike them with a closed fist. This is St. Robert Bellarmine. This is not whamsy-pamsy stuff that they pass out as if it were Catholic doctrine. This is the real thing. And he says if that's true for the body, if the Pope were to attack your soul, you have the right to resist and to cause others to resist. What St. Robert Bellarmine says is you don't have the right to depose, and that is where the sedevacantist make their mistake. They go beyond the authority God has given. Because if the church can be subverted from within, the faithful have a right to resist that subversion to the extent of their power and their ability and within their limit of authority. And that is a doctrine that's not been heard, and yet people somehow think I'm making this up or I'm rebellious. Go and read it for yourselves. I'll give you the references. And we've said this publicly many times. This is not to say, I propose very simply, that either the Pope is bound by Our Lady of Fatima to obey her and do the consecration of Russia, and he's bound by under pain of mortal sin, or he has the power to define this to be wrong. And I will accept his definition. But up to now, no pope has ever done that. In fact, as it's been pointed out, various popes, Paul VI, Pius XII, Paul VI, John Paul II, have all tried in their own incomplete way to do something in favor of the consecration that Our Lady asked for. Not one of them is saying we shouldn't do it. Not one of them is defining the popes are not bound if they have the possibility to do this. Because they know that they don't have that authority to refuse the Queen of Heaven. And therefore, for us to, or for me and for others, to promote the truth comes before, defending the truth comes before loyalty to the Pope. By all means, we must respect his person. By all means, we must respect his office. By all means, we must not arrogate to ourselves something that God hasn't given us. This is a distinction that people don't seem to understand, but Catholics have the obligation to resist against the encroachment against God's rights. When the Curé of Ars had a man come to confession to him one Saturday night, Saturday afternoon, or whatever day it was exactly, towards the end of the week, he received absolution. The next day he went to Mass, and the curé was walking down, minding his business, going to church, and the Curé of Ars called him over and said, "You must go to confession." And he said, "Why? I just went to confession yesterday, your Father." And he said, "No, you must go to confession." What was his sin? His sin was that he didn't go there for that reason. He went to a social function Saturday evening, and the hostess there had a seance held. In other words, invoking the devil. And it can cause possession, by the way, in some cases. The man didn't participate. But the fault was he didn't resist. And for not resisting, he wasn't doing his duty as a Christian soldier. And as such, he had sinned. So when we see things going wrong in the church, and we don't resist, we are also guilty. Saint Felix I, Pope, says, to know the truth and not defend it when you can is you are participant in that lie. The church militant is supposed to be the church militant. And this age should be more militant because we've got more evil around us today than any other time in the whole history of the church. And we've all been made into mamsy-pamsies doing nothing. And always saying, well, it's him, or it's her, or it's them, but it's never me. No, if you didn't resist, it's also you. And so it's our obligation. And if you don't know the truth, you don't have the conviction of it, I urge you to put your mind to work and learn the truth, because this item is the most important thing you need to know for our time. This is what God has told us must be done. And there's no other solution. And the sooner we get that in our heads and then we act upon it, the better off we're all going to be, including the Pope and everybody else around him. I don't know if this is clear to anybody, but I will certainly answer a second question on the subject.
I'd like to add something to that, too. Don Scupoli, in his classic, enduring classic, The Spiritual Combat, says that the devil always tries to conceal evil under the guise of good. And how many times people will say, you're disloyal to the church, you're disloyal to the Holy Father, don't be a troublemaker, follow the example of the saints and bow your head in blind obedience. Whereas the example of the saints is the opposite. We have, throughout history, great saints who have resisted the Pope, even publicly. Saint Athanasius, for one. Saint William of York was another. I named 3 other saints who threatened to publicly oppose the Pope in my book, The Suicide of Altering the Faith in the Liturgy. And so often people are deceived with this idea that the saints were men of blind and uncritical obedience. They were not. St. Peter was the first one who said we must obey God rather than men.
Well, that will conclude our session. I'm pleased to say that once again the devil's advocate has been routed. And we will be back in 15 minutes with Father Gruner's final address of the conference. Thank you.
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you. And I wrote back to him and I said, I appreciate very much your interest and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius XII, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist.